Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Night Owl's The Conversation part. This is Dan Sallitt, where I'm very honored to have him here again. Maybe some of you were here last night, where I said the following, which is that I think that the best introduction of him is the movie that you just saw. So he is a filmmaker and also a film, spent quite a bit of time as a film reviewer for the LA Reader, and is also a very great lover of movies. And so it's in those three capacities that we're going to be talking to him today. So the way this will go is that I will talk to Dan for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, ask him questions. You are allowed to ask me questions if you have any.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up for you guys to ask questions. Everyone who asks a question can get either a T-shirt or a tote bag. If you do ask a question, you can get your T-shirt or tote bag at the end, or you can get it right away. You don't need to wait. If you want to leave, like right after I ask your question, that's fine. You can leave whenever you want. We won't be offended, so you can stay as long as you feel like. Okay, so Dan, when we first met, we had this little exchange about a scene in this movie with the train. So it's this very striking scene because you're sitting there and waiting, and the train has to show up, and you're trying to find like my person among these people, and then you finally see Mara, and the camera tracks her. And you were saying a thing which I also thought, which is that this scene is ominous, and like something bad has happened to Joe, and you said something like, we want to mark this fact that like something bad happened to Joe, like some kind of suicide attempt, because like Joe, she's like a person, and like the loss of this person matters, and like she's precious, she's valuable, and then she gets lost over the course of the movie, and I was like, yeah, that seems right. And then like after you got out of the car, I had this thought like, wait a minute, you just made her up though. Like she's not a person, she's a fictional construct. And so I guess I just wanted to hear more about that. Like, how is it that fictional characters matter to us?
Oh, is this working? Yeah, I can hear it. I mean, at the very least, there is a fictional world up there, and there are other people there that Joe matters to. For instance, Mara. Mara's has mixed feelings about Joe, but I think basically it's a great like love and admiration and even an aspiration to be like her in some ways. So we have this even though they're both not real people, we have this world that we hopefully at least recognize where she counts. And it's an important question because you can dismiss a character. It's possible in your own mind to feel as if a character has to die, or it's better in a way if they get out of everybody else's way. It happens sometimes. And Joe kind of skirts the edge of that circumstance. You might be sufficiently irritated by her shortcomings and her inconsideration. Sometimes you might think that other people's lives would get on better without her. And so that's the distinction that I basically was trying to make, that I would never have made this movie without feeling love and compassion for Joe. And to the extent that she's irritating, it's in the script, I understand it, but it can't be the basis of the movie in my mind. I would never have gone there if it wasn't about losing someone who we can't afford to lose, and we lose her anyway.
And do you feel like, is the viewer supposed to be pulled between Mara and Joe? Are we supposed to be torn as to like which of these two people we care about more?
I don't think so. Mara's kind of steady through the movie. I think she's got a different role than Joe, and she appears in scenes differently for that reason. Joe is kind of the object and Mara is the subject in a way, and a lot of structure follows from that. I certainly value both of them myself. I don't know what difference that makes, whether I value them or not, but that's the spirit in which the film is made anyway. I don't feel as if one is forced to go one way or go the other. Just because Joe is sometimes thoughtless and inconsiderate and puts people out, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to choose, I think, between the two of them in terms of where our sympathies go. And Mara seems to agree. Mara seems to think that Joe means a lot.
I mean, maybe one of the things that pulls me in that direction is that there's this evident level of competition between them, at least on Mara's end. It's actually less clear that there is that competition on Joe's end, but Mara is constantly comparing herself to Joe, and she wants to know whether her boyfriend is into Joe, and Joe is good at writing, and Joe, which she feels like she's nothing. Like if she were to have a threesome with Joe, that she wouldn't be there, right? And like, do you feel like that sense of competition between them, which I think captures a very real aspect of friendship, does that make them closer as friends?
Competition is close to the word, but I don't know if I would quite call it competition, in that I think that Mara's dream world is harmony with Joe around and them both having achieved the things that they want. I don't think Mara's dream is to defeat Joe or to supplant Joe in anybody's affection. I think Mara loves her also. In some of the cases you mentioned, when Mara is very sad about Joe's writing being so good, I think Mara is just looking ahead at the ending and is like feeling like this is a terrible waste. And I think very often that's the case. Certainly she feels like, the child in her certainly feels like she's invisible next to Joe, that Joe is like majestic and glamorous, and she's lucky to be like, holding the train of her dress. But of course, the years go by and that gets a little modified.
So, like, this movie, when people say something is tragic, I think there's a couple of different things that they can mean by that. And this is certainly a tragic movie in the sense that what happens to Joe is sad. But, there's something, like, in ancient tragedy, there's this additional element in order to call it tragedy, which is that in some way the bad thing that happens is the work of the person to whom it happens, right? So like Oedipus, the bad thing that happened to him is a thing he did. In Antigone, the bad thing that happens to Antigone and to Creon's family, let's say, because Antigone's really about Creon. The bad things that happen in Creon's life are the things that Creon did. And in Medea, right? It's Medea does it. So there's this like additional sense of tragedy where it's not just what a loss, what a waste, a bad thing happened, as you might think if just like like Joe had like slipped and fallen and just died, or Mara, that could have happened to either one of them. But that in some way this result was in the cards, and it was always going to be this way. Mara says something like that, like we knew this was coming, kind of in the sense that like it was all along, it was being done by Joe, but also maybe by Mara.
Well, playing the tragedy game here, I think that Joe certainly has like some culpability. Certainly the actions that she takes, I wouldn't personally, I didn't think along those lines. I didn't necessarily want to give her a tragic flaw. But she, if you care to speculate about whether she could or could not abstain from the life that takes her in a bad direction, she's got some responsibility, I suppose. It just happens not to be the way I think about it. Actually, I don't think of it so much as being about a character of stature having fallen by her own hand or by the things that she does. I think of it more as being a collection of traits that, you know, seem not to promise well, and it's just a shame. It's a shame because the person has so much to offer, and not only has a lot to offer, but has offered that. She was very important to Mara. She's capable of a lot of things. That was the meaning of that little writing scene, that you know, there's something there.
I wasn't at all thinking about culpability. Like, arguably, Oedipus is not culpable. Creon probably culpable, but Oedipus, I mean, it's kind of hard to think he's culpable. Yeah. So the point isn't that the person somehow could have done something to avoid it. It's like actually pretty clear Oedipus couldn't. I mean, he was like was fated, right? But still, even when you couldn't have done anything to avoid it, like there's still a sense of you're the one enacting this. It's not something that's just happening to you. You're somehow doing it. And I guess my sense is it's not just Joe. It's also Mara. Like there's that scene where it is after maybe it's after she canceled the thing with her mom. And then she leaves and then she talks to
The boyfriend?
no, I think she's talking to her mom, and she says, you know, I can't deal with this. I'm backing off. She's gonna have to solve her own problems.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously she doesn't yet at that point. There's like a lot more. This is like to the mom and the mom's boyfriend. And that's the sense of like Mara like leaving Joe to her own devices, which we know the way that's gonna go. So my thought is there's something tragic about that. Not to say Mara should have done anything else, but to say that that's this is the story of that happening in some way.
And in fact, she doesn't quite. I mean, that statement of hers, as understandable as we might find it, she won't completely withhold, you know, her friendship or her help from Joe at times. Sometimes it feels more heartfelt than others, and as the film goes on, she is thinking a little bit more about building a life without Joe, which is, you know, possible for her. But yeah, I feel as if Joe. I didn't necessarily mean to use culpability as a moral. But I think Joe, to some extent, could be said to bear responsibility for some of the stuff that happens to her. I don't see the trouble here is I'm not all that interested in whether a person with an addiction can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps or not. I'm really sorry that Joe has this problem. Maybe she could have fixed it, handled things better. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe it's just in her psychology. Maybe it's in the stars. I don't know, but that's not really where my interest lies in making the movie. I think my interest really just lies in seeing that the person's valuable and seeing that they're lost and seeing the process as this, you know, pachinko ball kind of goes back and forth over the years.
One thing that really strikes me about how you've presented Joe is that there's just this mystery at the heart of what's happening to her, where she doesn't understand what's happening and doctors don't understand, and she doesn't know how to help herself, and nobody really knows how to help her. And I think, I guess I'm interested to hear you say more about that aspect of it.
Well, it's horrible to see yourself in a spot and not know the way out. And that the film was building to that one scene where Joe's defenses go down and she loses the social screens that keep her from like saying, you know, something. I mean, she spills everything out in that one kind of confessional or emotional scene. And I wanted to do that because I was very moved by the character. She is intelligent enough to be an observer of her own downfall. She's intelligent enough to know that she has value also. She's angry, but the anger is free-floating. It might be directed at her doctors, at Mara, at herself. It's, you know, the anger is this kind of flailing out at the universe, kind of like, you know, why does this have to be?
It strikes me there's a way that you were just talking about Joe, and it corresponds to the way you were talking about Mara earlier, where you say Mara's dream is harmony, where to me, like, these people seem really three-dimensional to you. Like it kind of feels like you see them as real people, or as you've plotted out a lot of stuff about them that doesn't directly show up in the movie. Is that something you did beforehand, or is that sort of constructed in your mind as you're making the movie, or even does it come afterwards?
I think it's definitely not constructed beforehand. I don't have a piece of paper somewhere with character breakdowns and things that don't find their way into the film. You hope that what the characters do suggests a full life. You hope that there's all the little hints that you give and all the resonances and implications of the little hints that you give, you hope that they all fit together into, you know, something that makes a three-dimensional character. It's not, of course, for me to say to what extent it does or doesn't, but that's like, I think when I write, certainly when I direct, I'm trying to give implications of actions and words. I'm trying to suggest that there's a couple things follow from these things that are said. And you hope that that creates a bunch of data which is coherent in a sense, that adds up to a person.
The scene, you know, with Mara and her daughter at the end, where is so emotionally affecting. And I say this as somebody, this is my fourth time watching this movie, and before, I came in here, I'm like, I'm not gonna cry this time, because I've already cried 3 other times, so I'm embarrassed, I'm sitting right next to the filmmaker, I'm not gonna start crying. I actually resolved in my head, I'm not gonna cry. And I was not able to not cry, and I'm not someone who cries at movies in general. And it's somehow, so do you have and I talked to some other people and they're like, yeah, I also cried. And do you have a theory of why that moment is so affecting?
It's meant to be affecting for sure. And also there's 2 scenes that mirror each other. There's Joe's breakdown, which also to me is a very affecting moment. Yeah. I was kind of sad during it. It's kind of almost like, the computer, HAL, breaking down in 2001 in a way. She's just dumping her, core information. With Mara, it was set up certainly to show that Mara is going to survive, that she's going to be able to occupy herself sufficiently with her daughter, with the other things in life that matter to her, with other friends, and that it's not the end of the world for her, but there's some little part of her that is still remembers and is deeply attached to the idea of Joe. She just is able to keep it in the background most of the time, and her daughter at that moment made it impossible for her to keep it in the background. Her daughter practically pressed the button that was going to make Mara break down.
Right.
And that was, to me, that was just a hole in her defenses, which will come back, who have come back already by the time she's sitting on the chairs drinking a glass of water. And she'll walk out of there with life in front of her. She has life in front of her during most of that time. Only once was she forced to look back at this hole that Joe has left by leaving her life.
At one point, it sort of occurred to me that maybe her daughter just replaced the Joe slot in her life, because here's someone she has to take care of, who has a lot of needs, and if I think about, there was an early scene where she had made a commitment to her mom, but she prioritized Joe over her mom. And I was thinking, that's the difference between your mom and your kid. Like, you'll dump your mom for your friend, but you won't dump your kid for your friend. So I wonder whether that's like, are we to sort of read Mara that way, that, this very needy friend just became someone she couldn't fit into her life once she had this other needy person there?
Well, there's another replacement also where Mara gets another kind of best friend,
right,
in a way. And we see that a fair amount of time is devoted to that. I think that in general, in the second half of the film, you feel the sands of time kind of shifting over the Mara-Joe kind of relationship. I think, to me, the Lorelei doesn't really feel like a Joe figure, doesn't really feel like a bottomless pit of need. Right. What's the word? Utility monster. I don't know if you ever heard that concept.
Yeah.
You know it. I feel as if it's just there are all these things that life starts stitching itself together around Joe's absence, and that's one of them. The child is only one of the things that constitute this new life that without Joe.
I'm interested to talk about time in this movie, like both from the point of view of the experience of the movie from the viewer's point of view, but also this movie, if I'm right, you filmed over a longer period in an unusual way for you.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start with that second thing. So yesterday you were telling us you filmed most of your movie, you tried to film in like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And so how long did this movie take you, and why did you do this differently?
I felt that I had to, because there were too many locations to do a film that moved through time, that didn't have both the unities there for you to make your job easier. It was just going to be way too much stuff. Too many actors that would have to be brought in and out. Too many changes. Too many locations. So I conceived it from the beginning. And also, you got different seasons and different times, which seemed kind of important. And I personally am moved by the fact that seasons and signals like that change on fast cuts sometimes. So you lose track very often of where you are in the seasons, where you are in the flow of their lives. I don't think I had the production resources to do it all at once is the most important reason, though. And it was logistically tricky.
So how long did the shooting take total? Like,
all in all, if you count the days, there aren't that many more. I think there were 22 shooting days, and in that 3-week format that I described, it's really only 18 shooting days anyway.
Right, but how long was that spread over?
It was spread over 2 years, but not quite a year and a half if you count like the beginning of the very first and the end of the very last shoot. But it was all through 2017 and 2018. 2 shoots in 2017, 2 shoots in 2018. In my mind, the script was divided into 9 movements. It's interesting that now that I see this film with a couple of years break, I don't feel the movements as much. But I always saw them before because I had the script in my head. Now I'm starting to lose all that stuff, and I couldn't have told you where the divisions were very clearly. But when I was scheduling, I said, okay, first shoot is movement 1 and 2. Second is 3, 4, and 5, that sort of thing.
So, like, I had this experience. I have to go back to my first viewing because it's quite different once you've seen the movie once and you have a sense of the chronology. But my first viewing, I just spent a lot of the first third of the movie kind of confused about time, where I'm like, wait a minute, how much longer has it been? At first, it didn't even occur to me that a lot of time might have passed. But then I would be like, oh, wait, the apartment looks different. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to other people who had the same sort of response. So like the viewer has to do this thing where they self-consciously reflect on time and are a bit confused about time and are asking themselves questions about how long has it been since the last. Like I very much wondered that about with the scene in the train scene, comes right after the scene where Joe is smoking in her apartment. And like, even this time around, I was like, I wonder how much longer that's supposed to be after that scene. Clearly, it's not right away because we hear about the movie that they went to or whatever. Anyway, like I guess you're intending for the viewer to be sort of asking themselves these questions about the passage of time.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to give certain markers that made it really clear the time was passing. I don't think it's super important that we know exactly how much time is passing. The whole action of the film is just kind of suspended in the course of their lifetime. So I don't think the film would get better or worse if we knew that 2 years had passed or 1 month had passed. But there are boyfriends that come and go. There's children. There's a child who grows up. There's lots of little things that I wanted to be clear, clear indications that something had changed. And I hoped that people would get the feeling pretty quickly that we were jumping through these lives, and that, it was, don't worry about exactly how much time has passed. It's just passing.
Joe really likes dessert.
Joe really.
So in the very first scene, she's eating like a candy bar, and then she wants to go out for more dessert. She pops in, like that's so wonderful, that scene where she disappears, and she gets the brownie. Later, she offers more ice cream. Now, yesterday when I asked you, why is there a lot of food? Why is there so much food in this movie? You're like, because people eat a lot. But like, do you, so now I'm wary of asking you, like, why is Joe so into dessert?
No, Joe is a special case. Joe likes dessert because she has not got a lot of impulse control, I think. I just kind of felt that it was right. I knew somebody, actually, I'm not going to drag that person's name in, but I knew somebody who simply did not, when they thought of a dessert, they didn't have a system to suppress that desire. They just went for the dessert. And I thought it was very appropriate. I think that Joe simply is a creature of the moment in certain ways.
Right. There's a lot of doors and doorways in this movie, and like often you see a door and you first see the door or something, and then someone shows up, or and there's not a lot of space continuity, or there's a lot of different spaces, but like it felt to me like one of the constants was doors and doorways.
I don't think it was certainly not something that I intended in any kind of symbolic way, and it also wasn't something I kind of worked up. But when you're filming something like this, which is urban people living in apartments, scenes in apartments, it becomes important. Like the kitchens also become important. The ways that people light apartments at night. There's certain things that I saw recurring, but it was all just trying to represent in a couple of different locations in a couple of different ways these things that happen in this apartment dwelling class of the world.
When I see, like, Brooklyn is very familiar from movies, but it doesn't look the same in your movie. Like, I feel like I'm seeing something, and it looks different, and I'm not sure why. Like, it doesn't feel like movie Brooklyn or something? Why is that?
I don't know. There's no landmarks for sure. I didn't show, the little arch in Prospect Park or whatever people do for Brooklyn. I don't know. It's all very small scale. You're always down on the street and right next to what's going on. You do see some people walking on streets. You see a lot of apartments. I felt this time as I was watching the movie, a lot of like inner life. It could have been someplace other than Brooklyn, but cumulatively, I think it just feels as if you're in a particular place. Some of the stuff might have happened in Manhattan. I'd have to think about it. I think it wasn't meant to be, lodged in one borough, but it was meant to be a certain kind of lifestyles of a certain kind of young person's class, and I just wanted it to accumulate. I don't think there's anything that says Brooklyn unequivocally. I might be wrong about that.
Yesterday you talked a little bit about self-financing, and I wanted to ask you just like another question about that, which is like, why? So maybe I'll say something for people, because many of you were not here yesterday. Dan told us that he self-finances his movies, so you just save up money from work, I take it, right? And so you told us that the movie last time cost you about $50,000. What did this one cost?
100.
100. Okay, so this
maybe 95.
Okay, so it takes you maybe like 5 years or so to save up, something like that.
This one was shot over a long period of time, unlike any other film I did. So I was working while I was shooting, which felt kind of luxurious, like money was coming in. I didn't have to worry about the bank account dwindling with nothing coming into it.
Okay, so this is really extraordinary, though. People don't do the thing you're doing, as far as I know. Why? That is, there's some other way, I guess, I don't really know it, that people make movies where they get other people to give them money to make the movie, and you earn your own money to make your movie, and so why do you do it your way?
Well, because I don't know it either. I don't know how anybody talks anybody into like giving them a lot of money to make something that's not going to make money back. If I thought my movies were going to make money back, if I figured that out, that would be different. Then I would not feel like a complete con artist. But going to somebody and saying, give me money to make this movie so I could realize my vision and nothing else whatsoever, not a business proposition, I don't know how to do that. And I realized pretty early I didn't have the right temperament to like kind of hustle up money for independent projects. I think I was pretty lucky that my life came together in such a way that I was able to save the money for movies. There was a time when I wasn't sure that was going to happen. A key element of my life as it exists now coming together was me switching from like little poorly paid film-related jobs to computer jobs to jobs in tech. And this was lucky that I was able to switch. It's not something that is the easiest thing to do, but when I was 32 or something, I talked some people into giving me a job at a computer company, and I kind of rose in the company. I was there for 7 years, acquired skills that I then was able to parlay into a life, a career as a tech writer. If I hadn't been able to do that, then I don't know, then this whole edifice kind of crumbles.
One way you described your goal in our conversation yesterday was that you kind of want to add, I may not be getting you exactly right, but something like contribute like a little piece to like cinema history or something like that. And I wonder whether you think of that as, so I have a colleague who said of his books, like, I don't care that they get as many readers as possible. What I want is for the book to find its reader, in the sense, the way I think about it is like fishing for a kindred spirit. Like, you want your movies, is it that you want your movies to speak to people who are like you? Like, is there like a certain kind of person that you are, and you're reaching out into the world for that kind of person, both now and in the future, and you're making movies for that person? Or like, what else does it mean to contribute to cinema history?
I think you're getting at something that's really very fuzzy if you examine it too much. It's like, it's kind of, I'm looking for something to replace the existence of God. You know, I'm looking for a meaning to life. And it's not that I believe in anything. It's not that I believe that my life is going to be any more, any longer or any more eternal because I've achieved some goal of making some movies. So I'm kind of waving my hands, as they say in math, over the key theorems there. The fact, becoming part of film history sounds a little bit eternal, I guess. It means something to me because I care a lot about film history. And so it's something that I personally can relate to. But the fact is, it's as, there's kind of there's kind of not a very solid answer, no more than there's an answer to what gives anybody's life meaning in an objective sense. You kind of choose some subjective goal to give your life meaning, and if you achieve the subjective goal, you might even feel that you've given your life meaning. And that's the whole story, really.
I'm now going to ask you a question from my son. My son, Abe, who's 19, is a huge fan of Dan. And so he wanted me to ask you this question. He said that in Romerian, it will often happen that the internal world of the character is shattered by some reality at the end of the movie. Is that what you see happening in this movie, where the death of Joe is sort of the intrusion of reality into Mara's self-construct?
I would not say to Abe, who I know, by the way, at least online, I would not say that there was a particularly Romerian cast to that plot development. In Romerian, the way it usually works is that everybody's sort of content with the way an ending has arrived or been achieved in real life, and then Romerian will show you a few things that kind of make it look as if it's not that neat, that it hasn't really been resolved that much. If he's being really frisky, he might completely reverse the meaning that he felt that he was gave people, which is what happened in Claire's knee, or he might just introduce some outside elements. And I was dealing more in a more dramatic, less commentative sense when I oversaw Joe's death and Mara's bereavement.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to ask maybe just 2 more questions, and then I've already gone over a little, but I have so many questions for you. The beginning scene where with the kids, was that hard to film? With all those kids doing their thing and being kids, did you have to direct them? Did you have to say act like kids, or how did that work?
No, not too much in that case. It was a little harder with Lorelai, the older Lorelai. There were 2 Lorelis. But Lorelai was good, it turns out. The second Lorelai was, an asset to the movie.
Yeah.
No, those kids just ran wild, and all I did was put a very intelligent actress in the middle of them, it's her nature to react to what goes on around her. She's also very good with kids anyway, and it's something that I've seen in other things that she did with other directors even. So
This is Tali.
This is Tali. So that's just kids in a preschool being wild, Tali reacting to them, reacting to the other teacher that's there, who's a real teacher. I just inserted her into a real environment, cut it together in such a way that it had a little bit of coherence, and that Tali's role was, brought out of the background just a tiny, tiny bit.
And what about with Lorelai, with the 2 Lorelais? Had you directed kids before?
Yeah, I think I have, but there's nothing you can do. I mean, it's not as if you're sitting down with the kid and making some mind meld that somehow makes them perform better. What you're doing is just hoping you could find somebody who's comfortable, who likes to play a little bit in front of the camera. And that was Lorelai number 2, whose name is really Lorelai in real life. I named the first character because I knew that the second character was coming. She's just kind of good, and we gave her guidelines. Tali helped a lot by keeping it fresh so that the kid never felt as if she was in some kind of framework. Rigid framework. Tali always kept it very loose, would ask her new questions, and the kid was very happy, it seems, luckily, to play along with the game and to invent her own stuff within the game. It's kind of cool and fun to see.
Okay, my last question, and then we'll go to your questions. So the last movie event that I did before yesterday, was on this movie Banshees of Inisherin, and my husband came up with this sentence about what the movie was about. And ever since then, I've watched so many movies and been like, oh, wait, that's also what that movie is about. Wait, that's also what this movie is about. So I'll tell you the sentence, which is, we need... Sorry?
I said boy meets girl.
No, but that movie is really not about that. It's about everything else, but not that. We need things from other people that they don't owe us. I feel like that's also what this movie's about. Like, there were things that Jo needed from Mara, and she really needed them. And Mara, tried to give her stuff, but like Mara didn't owe her that. And at a certain point, that just falls away, and there's something tragic about that. There's something tragic about the relations in which people stand to one another, that we can need things from people that they don't owe us.
Yeah, but like the trouble with meaning is that it's always reductive. Even if it's not one sentence, it's always reductive. And I personally, to me, the accent is not on Mara backing away because she doesn't owe Jo anything. The accent is really on how much this difficult relationship was terribly important to Mara, and the loss of it hurts. But it's true, yeah. There is in an aspect of Mara backing away because of a realization that she just can't shoulder all these burdens anymore. It's not, to me, I'm not. It's kind of hard to say what a movie's about, and so it's not a. The one-line thing is a tricky business.
Okay, questions. And where's Audrey? Oh, there. Okay, maybe Audrey, can you come and sit up here? And then after you ask your question, if you want to immediately get your t-shirt back, you can, or you can wait until the end. Up to you. Okay, questions. Raise your hands a little higher, because Tyler can't see you. He's behind you.
Lots of questions.
You want me to pick people?
Yes.
Oh.
That's part of the job.
You go? Thanks. Yeah.
I remember there was a long shot of the film, in the film of the train.
Mm-hmm.
It lasts about like 1 minute.
Yeah, I
Or a
can't
couple
remember how
minutes.
long, but yeah.
What was the intention of that?
That shot, there's more than one intention. It's a moment in the film where I felt that something that changes the rhythm is appropriate, because I felt that, and you will figure out pretty soon, that Jo has almost died, and maybe you have an intuition that she is going to die. I certainly did, and I the gravity of that scene seemed appropriate to me for that reason. But also, I do like to sometimes holding on to actions, if you have half an excuse, is appropriate and nice. And there's like a lot of stuff in this movie, I hope, where you see a kind of completeness of the environment, where you see a full environment where you don't necessarily need it, or you see an action completed where you didn't necessarily need it, because that stuff's beautiful. And trains are beautiful for sure, and the process of a train arriving and discharging its passengers and moving on is rather attractive, and you get to see the suburban life with people, commuters, getting off the train and getting into the car that's waiting for them. So there's a lot. To me, it was like kind of interesting in itself, because it's a train maybe, or because it's of whatever. But also, I wouldn't have done that right then if I didn't have this sense that the film was flirting with darkness, and you might as well encounter some of that darkness at this point,
Hi. Yesterday you were talking about how you really resonated with Tally as an actress and how she really brought Jackie's character to life in The Unspeakable Act. And for this movie, did you conceive of Mara as a character prior to casting Tally, or did Tally inspire her character in some way?
Tally totally inspired her character. I actually wanted to write, conceived this movie for Tally and another actress who I wanted to make a movie with. And that was all I started with, was the two actresses. And the other actress just wasn't in a position in her career, I think, to do this movie. So I had to cast that role, but it was intended to be written for Tally and for somebody else. And writing stuff for Tally is a great pleasure, I must say. I don't, if I had to make movies for the rest of my life that were just things written for Tally, I could really think of worse fates than that. She's kind of wonderful, in my opinion. Very, very, I feel a lot of connection with, what I want to do and what she wants to do. I'll just say one more thing in answer to that question, since I'm on the verge of it, which is my whole career alternates between writing a script, not knowing who it's for, and finding an actor, and then making the following movie where I've got the actor already, so I write something for them. There's a few projects that fell through, but if you throw in the projects that fell through, there's a strict alternation between films where I had to start all over and films where I wanted to stick with what I already found. So.
That's cool.
Hi, I was curious what the initial spark was for this film and how you would compare that to what we saw, specifically in how you developed your characters, how that evolved, and what your writing process might look like. I'm assuming Robert Bresson influence a little bit, and was curious if you could synthesize it all with notes on cinematography and whether or not, or to what extent you were capable of developing your own voice that is very distinct and unique, and how you've developed your own creative process.
Well, I yield to none in my admiration for Bresson. I think maybe that particular influence might be indirect a little bit, in the mind of maybe thinking more directly about people that were influenced by him. Frankly, I find it really, to imitate Bresson seems like a sucker game. In a way, you can't be Bresson. And the things that he makes work, I wouldn't have the nerve to walk into those waters, I'd trust that it would come out that way. So I will just confess that I would find him a very formidable and intimidating kind of, mentor if I were doing something like that. In terms of the working method, I really think that it's always different. In this particular case, I really started with Tally and one other actress. That's all I had. And I took some stuff from everyday life. I mentioned a little while ago the person I know personally, or knew personally, who likes desserts so much. Well, there are people like that kind of lent something to this film without necessarily knowing it. There's characters who are grow out of, things that I've seen. But the basic formation of the film was around two actresses who I thought would be very interesting together, and trying to get the vibes of those people. And it's kind of interesting to me that, Tally, for me, her vibe was stable. That I wanted Tally to be the person who holds things together, even though that wasn't necessarily a lot like the character that she played for me already. But I do have this image of Tally and I know her also, and so the ability of the Mara character to try to hold things together and try to fix things is inspired by my private, maybe, image of Tally. Certainly, it started with that.
Can I have a follow-up here? Because you were saying, oh, it would be silly to imitate Bresson. And yesterday you said that about Lubitsch. And so I'm wondering, is there a director where you think it wouldn't be foolish to imitate them, but they're admirable?
Yes. No, it's an individual thing, I guess. You know, Wilder imitated Lubitsch, and sometimes he made it work. I imitate Romerian freely and joyfully. And in recent years, I started imitating Piala fairly freely here. And
I don't actually know who that is.
Maurice Piala is a French director who whose films are a little rougher in terms of the human interactions, but who feels very free to fragment time and give you abrupt jumps, not only in characterization, but also in where you are in the narrative. Really, really good director. And I probably have others also that I actually feel empowered to steal from. And I don't know, I wouldn't steal from Lubitsch because I would not feel like I could pull it off. And Bresson, just look, he's just out there in outer space. I'm very happy he was with us, but I'm not gonna pull it off if I try to.
I don't mean to imply that you were derivative.
No, you didn't imply that at all. You were fine. We're working our way across the room. The questions have been like.
So I want to remind folks, if you ask a question, you can have a tote bag or a T-shirt. So you can get them now or later. Let's see. You know, I just walked all the way across, but
Hi. I wanted to talk a little bit about telephone calls. There's a lot in this movie, and and it makes sense. I think that there's no cutaways. I think it works with what you're doing, but it does mean you're with one actor for a long time. And I know you care a lot about conversations in your movies as well. So I was interested to just sort of hear you talk about that. And there's two in particular that struck me here too, because they're initiated by, not by Mara or by Joe, but by Tim and by the earlier of Joe's boyfriends. So they actually have a lot of time. We don't necessarily see that much of them for the rest of the movie, but they're the ones giving us some pretty critical information. So I wanted to hear about the decision making to use that format so much, and what your thoughts.
Well, phone calls are cool. I mean, everything is cool, and they happen a lot. Just, you know, I think a lot of things are just in the films because they feel natural, and we should be able to figure out how to film them. And then it's not inconceivable that I would fragment a call, because there are dramatic needs sometimes that you have to follow, and not just your fascination with what one part of reality looks like when it's disconnected from the rest. Because I think it's fascinating to see somebody have a phone conversation and hear half of it. That's really interesting to me. If you put both sides in, it becomes a dramatic exercise. But maybe it's, excuse me. But it's also a lot of fun just to preserve the space and to see what happens, how a two-way conversation looks when you're just planted somewhere and hear half of it. I'll make the decision depending on, you know, the various circumstances. Like, I can't think whether I cut any phone conversations into pieces here, but I might have. Just sometimes you feel like the dramatic is more important than that sense of the space.
Yeah, thank you.
There was an interesting thing you did, which is the very first phone call at the very beginning of the movie. So that's Mara gets called by Joe, right? And then she agrees that she's going to go over to her house. And then the next thing we see is Joe on the phone, not with Mara, right? But you kind of cut to Joe on the phone with her supervisor. So it's almost like it's like we got the other side of the conversation, but not of that conversation. I wondered whether that was like intentional.
I think Mara hangs up clearly, right? So we know that it's not the same conversation.
Right.
No, it was just there because I thought the world has a lot of phone calls in it, and I was quite amused by Jo treating her superior as if she was a flunky, like just obviously trying to get her off the phone because what she said was not going to be of any use to her.
Right.
So Professor Callard mentioned that these feel like very three-dimensional characters, but at times it feels like that's held back a little bit from what we see in the actual film. And I noticed that with some of the dialogue where it felt like these characters, despite knowing each other for so long, weren't being entirely honest with each other, or even like in that like.
Did you say honest?
Yeah, or even in that like climactic breakdown scene, Jo is still saying, "I need you to be nice to me," and Mara is nice to her. I think more than we would expect most people to be. What was the intentionality like behind that?
I don't know. In that particular case, Mara was in a rare moment of like giving Jo an unvarnished opinion of how much she had been inconvenienced. So, but Jo can't take even a little bit of that. Mind you, I think that Mara was really, taking off the gloves right there at that moment. She was frustrated and she was lashing out. But Jo, just like she can't ignore the call to desert, also is not able to deal with criticism. Criticism from the outside will make her feel so bad so immediately that she's going to act somehow about it. She can't. This is something I picture in Jo, but it's under there somewhere. There's certain people who, when they hear something said to them from the outside that is occasionally being said to them from the inside and suppressed or shut up, it becomes very, very painful. And that, I think, is what was happening there. I would say, on the whole, the characters are pretty open with each other. Mara and Jo have more or less a history of, communicating with each other pretty well. They could steer into some waters where maybe a lot is left unsaid, more and more is left unsaid. But I didn't want to have a structure where they were, purposely withholding something or, dodging things in their conversations. I wanted to convey the sense that basically they knew each other pretty well. Basically, they were in the habit of talking to each other directly, and anything else would be because of duress.
It strikes me about that scene that like Mara's pregnant, right? Like, we only find that at the end of the scene, but she's like, Jo is like once again making everything all about her, and Mara has this really like big thing in her own life, right? That maybe she would have told Jo at dinner, and she still has to talk to Adam about it. They haven't like had a conversation about it. There's some conversation about that they want to have. So it's like after this first time I saw it, my interpretation was like, this is part of why Mara lashes out at her, is like. She's like, oh, you're gonna make this all about you again. Like not even one time, not even when I'm pregnant, do I get to be like the center of the story.
Well, Mara's first reason for lashing out is that it's 12:30 at night, and Jo makes it look like she's there to apologize when really she just needs company, as she often does. So Mara has read that page already. Mara's like a little bit ahead of the game here. She knows what's going on. And I think, she would have. You're right. She would have had this big news. But I don't know if it was a big source of her distress that she got upstaged. I think that was just, I think it was more built into the dynamic of Mara and Jo that could be so imbalanced at times.
Makes sense.
Hello. So something that really interested me was the kind of version of Jo that Mara had created in her head, and that really comes through when Adam first meets Jo and says that he expected her to be a lot more glamorous. And then we also see throughout the movie this idealized Joe kind of breaking down in Mara's head. So I was just curious to hear your personal thoughts, and this is directed at both of you, on kind of how we cherry pick things about people to include in this idealized version, and how it's often in tension with who they really are, and how these idealized versions kind of break down.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a good comment, I think, and it was definitely something that I wanted. But I feel that Mara's idealized version of Joe is something she had from childhood, and she had this very, very strong love of Joe in childhood that eventually was tested a lot, but when I think in situations like that, certain aspects of that love just shine through, like the fact that Mara can't imagine that anyone wouldn't find Joe beautiful. I think that even though Mara has gone through many stages with Joe, I think there's things left in our personality that were formed in earlier stages that we don't even realize are still there. In some sense, Joe has some goddess-like qualities for Mara, and even when some of them go away, she might not always be aware that it has not, completely changed.
I think it's really interesting to compare the different ways in which they are reliant on an image of the other. So, like, I think it's right that Mara has this idealization of Joe, and it really works. Like just the physicality of like how tall she is and the long hair, she looks like a goddess. But then there's also a way in which Joe, like, it's not quite that she idealizes Mara, but like she needs Mara to be sort of her crutch, and that's like only one aspect of Mara can come to the fore. And like when she's like, I need you to be nice to me, like there's a way in which Joe can be cutting, but Mara is not permitted to be, right? So there's someone Mara has to be for Joe. And that's not quite the same as a fantasy, but it's not 100% of Mara that is like permitted. It's like only one facet of her or something like that.
I think in her way, Joe might have a more accurate, Joe might be less burdened by mythologizing than Mara is in this regard. I think Joe genuinely likes Mara as a human being, has ever since she like saw these good things in her in childhood. And in her way, even though Joe is outwardly looks like the more, prestigious and glamorous of the two, I think Joe has always thought that Mara was just a good person and someone she was very happy to be her friend. I think that she's in a way she's kind of clear-eyed about that. I believe her own needs, of course, obtrude sometimes, get in the way, but I do think she has Mara's number more in a way, clearly.
There's in the very beginning, one of them says to the other, I wrote it down, but I didn't write who says it. You're projecting.
Oh, that was Mara saying that to Joe about, there's some conversation, there's a phone conversation where we don't hear everything that's going on, but Joe is talking about whatever Mara's doing with her boyfriend.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Joe thinks it was some other guy, that she's going back to some guy.
Yeah, her old boyfriend. No, why? And Mara says, no, why would I ever do that?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm interested in the moments of breakdown or crisis that you were talking about earlier, both from Mara and Joe, because I think so much of the film is about emotional regulation and like a sort of quietness, but also because it reminds me of something from Lauren Berland, where they talk about how moments of breakdown are moments of us realizing the ways in which the world is always unlivable or unbearable all the time. And so it's like a sort of like way of garnering knowledge. And so I'm wondering, in those moments of breakdown, is there something that they learn that we don't have access to about the world of the film?
I like that, but just give me again before you stop talking the name of where you what you were referencing.
Yeah, it's Lauren Berlant, and some of it is in Cruel Optimism, is a book that they wrote, and then the other is more recent, On the Inconvenience of Other People.
I think it's true in a way that it's kind of the leitmotif of a sad movie, that when things go really bad is kind of the truth sometimes. And it kind of fits with a Freudian view of life also, where we just kind of shore up our defenses and try to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Even though if we really looked at what was going on, it might be too much sadness for us to take. No, I don't necessarily want the movie to be bathed in that kind of despair. I wanted to show some good things too. I wanted to feel that there were value in those people, which I think there is. But that's what makes a breakdown so powerful for sure, is the difficulty of denying anything that is said when you're peering into the void. It's it's a void.
I just wanted to ask you about that. I mean, the line was shoring up defenses. I was very struck by how Joe's very defensive, and you see her defenses. Almost everything she says, up until the breakdown scene is she's brushing stuff off all the time. And I wonder, and it's really remarkable, the actress just does a remarkable job with that, I think. But is that part of why Mara can have this fantasy of her, this somewhat, it feels like Mara is always herself. And so it's she's presenting herself as herself to Joe, whereas Joe is not quite presenting herself as herself to Mara. Joe is presenting a slightly polished front where there's more crisis behind it than she's letting on. Is that does that fuel Mara's sort of fantasy of her?
I don't know. I think that Mara doesn't present herself as much in general, one way or another. And Joe has a need to have a narrative of her life sometimes, even though she at other times is fully aware that this narrative is false. But I think that's the way life is. People are going to say, oh, I was late for that meeting, but that wasn't really the problem. And there might be times when she knows full well that might have been the problem, that a certain number of late appearances might add up in a boss's mind. But yeah, so those are just, she's got an insecure grasp on on that. She has to have an insecure grasp on how much she's fucking up, to use her phrase. And then when she breaks down, its clarity has arrived, and when she's crying, she says it true. She says, it's because I fuck up. So I would say that Mara's idealization is, I understand it completely. I think it was somebody who not only was glamorous and heroic, but was genuinely good to her and genuinely helpful. And she totally, she knows that Joe saw through young Mara's, young Mara was not quite so visible to the world. People would pick on her for whatever reason. And Joe was never tempted, and even, came to her rescue and immediately adopted her as a friend. That's a lot. I think that Joe gets credit for that. So Mara's idealization is kind of almost understandable, given that this is a person who was pretty good to her at an important time.
So you mentioned that inspiration from people in your life for the food aspects of Joe. Are there any other people, real or fictional, that inspired other more salient aspects of Joe?
Yeah, I'm sure, but it's really hard to remember those things after a certain point, because that's the first thing you put away. I mean, once you write a script, you might have those things, you might remember most of those things, but years later, that one person who could not turn down a dessert. It has several other Joe-like qualities. And you would not recognize her in real life as Joe, but she was also in that kind of same line of general professional category as Joe. She also could not be on time to save her life. And so I did borrow some stuff from this person. But you wouldn't recognize her. If you met her in real life, you wouldn't say, this is Joe. It's not that much. And there's some other things here and there that came from somebody in real life and were given to somebody. And that stuff always happens, and it's not necessarily as if you want to make a picture of that person. It's just that, you're just grabbing from whatever you can, and finally it takes on its own identity, one hopes.
So you kind of talked about these characters as being three-dimensional in your head or when you wrote them or think about them, but when I was watching the movie, at least for like the first half of it, I really couldn't help but view Joe as some sort of caricature. And I was trying to figure out why, and I just kept thinking about like all the patterns that she's stuck in, like the dessert thing, and like it was kind of proven to me that she was a caricature when like the scene that she disappeared and everyone in the theater laughed. I was like, okay, this feels like kind of a joke on her. And I don't know. So then I started thinking about Aristotle, and I was like, he says this thing about tragedies where in order to be realistic, they have to walk this fine line between pitying and fearing the characters, or pitying and fearing for the characters. And I was wondering if maybe I don't see her as that realistic because like we pity her too much, or like we see her as an object of our pity in the movie. So yeah, I don't know if there's any clarity you could offer on this dilemma of mine.
Well, the tragedy thing is hard for me to address because I didn't exactly see Joe that way. I wasn't thinking of her as somebody who would be, laid low by forces. But the fact that I might be thinking in terms of 3 dimensions is something that I could understand if other people didn't see. At any given moment in a movie, I don't think you're seeing all 3 dimensions. It's just kind of a cumulative effect that you hope is there if you're trying for it. You really, at any given moment, are seeing what a character presents you with, and that may be full of mysteries because you're seeing them from the outside. So I'm not really answering your question too well, and I don't think I can answer it too well, but I would be comfortable with the idea. I mean, I think that anything I might have said about it being a 3-dimensional character might be my fancy if I put together a lot of different components and hoping that they all fit together, not the experience that you would get at any given point in a film, which experience I don't think depends too strongly upon understanding the character completely. It's a lame answer to what you were saying.
Let me add something to it, and this just might be me in terms of how I'm seeing Joe, but to me, part of what strikes me as tragic here, as in so many tragedies, it feels as though the person is fighting her fate and her fate is fighting back. Like there's this, René Girard has this definition of the sacred as that set of forces that increase in proportion to our attempts to resist them, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But there's this sense that Joe doesn't want to be Joe. Like she wants to get over her problems, and like every time she's going out to get a dessert, or she's kind of picking herself up, and she's like, it's okay. Like I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna get another job. I'm gonna manage. Like she's with the new guy. When she's like wearing that pretty dress. Like it's like she's putting herself together again, and yet it keeps falling apart. And so it's not just that a bunch of stuff is happening to her, it's that it's happening in spite of her resistance and in spite of Mara's resistance, right? They're both fighting this thing, and they just lose. And they lose because the thing that they're fighting is fighting back in proportion to their efforts. And that, I think, to me, is scary. It's genuinely frightening that your mind and your life can turn on you in that way.
I like what you say, but I would modify it slightly by observing that some of this stuff that's fighting back seems as if it's coming from within Joe.
Oh, absolutely.
Nothing's making Joe be late a million times.
Right.
Or maybe something is, but you can't really tell.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely is coming from within her. That, yeah.
I feel like I've been describing your films to people all weekend as like that you are a filmmaker who makes films about women. You're like a male filmmaker who makes films about women that like could have been made by women. And I was really interested by the conversation at the beginning of the film, about Mara's story, where this like whatever like the literary like jerk is like, why did you make this character a man? And I just wonder about like how you think about. You're so good at writing the way that like women talk to each other in private, and I wonder how you think about like writing these rooms that like you could like never be in, really.
Maybe one is in those rooms sometimes, because I think there's a certain amount of observational stuff going on. I really appreciate your sentiment, and any answer to that has to be a little bit like psychosexual, which is uncomfortable. It's not, obviously some part of me identifies with those characters. The first thing I thought to myself when I started making movies where women were featured prominently, the first thing I thought to myself was a little bit of a rationalization. I thought, well, it's natural that I should be more interested in making movies about women because I'm attracted to women. And I remember Truffaut saying, when he had to shoot one day in his film diary without the lead actress, he said, oh, like the dreariness of like a set without a woman, it just like making movies for him was associated with sexuality. But that's not the whole thing, I guess. It's not just that you get the pleasure of, making movies about a gender that is your like sexually preferred gender. There's some identification going on there. I'm not sure that my speculating much about that identification will help you or anybody else understand it. But
yeah, I'm very struck by it too. It's specifically that I do think that there's a lot of conversations in this movie that are the kinds of conversations women have with one another when there are no men around. And so it hadn't occurred to me to put it that way, but I'm like, right, you wouldn't have heard those. So, but maybe in some way they're not as different as we think they are from other sorts of conversations, or it's possible to triangulate.
It's possible to triangulate, I think. It's also possible that maybe they aren't as different, but it's possible to triangulate because, if you hang out with women a lot, as a lot of men do for sure, you get a lot of material to triangulate. So it didn't seem like it was some big reach to me when I would write. I can't even offhand say which scenes are particularly scenes where I wasn't supposed to be able to eavesdrop on them because it doesn't occur to me like that. I was just writing from the people. What would empower me to allow myself to think that I was able to identify with those people enough to write them? I don't know. That's like it would be weird for me even to address that issue.
Oh, but my question was so similar. Well, less gender, I guess, and more like some of it felt like very like millennial, I guess, but not in like not in like a grating way. But I was just surprised that it felt like, I don't know, like something that, like, it felt like so much like actual conversations that I've had or been privy to, that I kept finding myself, like normally I try to pay some attention to like, the stuff about like shots and whatnot. And instead I just keep like responding automatically as though I'm actually there in the room going, and like laughing at all the right places. Or like, I don't know, the places that you would laugh like if you were actually there. And it was almost like eerie for me. Like I had to keep kind of going like, no, this isn't real. Like they're not. But so I guess, I don't know, maybe that's something that you were going after, but I guess I was just surprised that, like, oh, right, okay. I was wondering if, like, there was input, I guess, from any of the actors with regards to the script, like if any of them were like, oh, I wouldn't necessarily say it that way, I would more say it like this, and if that, like, influenced you, or if you just, like, wrote the script, and then gave it to them, and then they did it as is, yeah.
These are both extremely complimentary questions, by the way. I really appreciate the thought. I don't, Tally always, when we're talking together to audiences, she always says, no, Dan writes the script. Everything is written. I'm not so sure that there aren't times when I don't actually seek feedback. And definitely I'm writing this script for someone who is younger than me, who I know and who I've gotten to know, have worked with. So there's some of that, at least, in there. That, but it's very hard for me to judge which. I don't purposely fill my scripts with age-specific jargon. So I suspect that some of this stuff might play okay in the mouths of other generations as well.
I almost feel like that's what makes it feel so real, is that a lot of movies really take this effort to be age-specific, and then that's not actually how people talk.
Yeah, that would be nice if that were the case. I like that.
Yeah, like the opposite of glass.
You always have these very sharp little comments like that. Wouldn't have thought of that.
Thank you. I was thinking, so I think that a lot of questions have revolved around this and about the realness of it. And throughout the movie, I was thinking of your movie as a portrait. I think that it really does look like real people. And so that I think that brings to why it really is art. You're able to capture ordinary moments in a way that make us feel like we could actually be there. And so I think that is very powerful, because it then makes us ask us these philosophical questions that go beyond kind of like the intentions that you had when you were writing the characters. So this question is more for Professor Callard, about why it is that these ordinary moments are beautiful. What is it that we find in that becomes art, even though they're they're ordinary, and what about those ordinary moments makes us ask us these philosophical questions that we're having here, right? That maybe when I am having a conversation with a friend, that doesn't come up, but when I watch it, it does.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it reminds me of something that a gentleman was asking yesterday. I remember he was like seated over there, but about where the first part of his question was about this feeling of universality. And this movie yesterday was about brother-sister incest, right? And he's like, it's weird because you might think that it wouldn't be so relatable, you wouldn't feel like this is some universal thing because you want to place this distance, and yet it does feel universal. And similarly in this movie, look, here's someone with some unspecified mental illness, and you may not have had a friend like that, and yet it feels universal somehow. And I find that actually very mysterious, how that like you could watch something that was just like an experience you'd actually had and not have that feeling of universality. And you can watch something where you never experienced it before and have this feeling of universality and relatability. You know, maybe there's something, it seems to me that there is something like, some part of it is like, when we're going through our lives, we're mostly not paying attention. Like, we're ignoring almost everything that's happening because there's something in our head, like whatever we're doing at that moment, like I'm always reminded, I'm scattered, and so, like, what am I doing next? You know, I have a meeting, I have an appointment, this is the thing I have to get done today, so I'm thinking about what's gonna happen next, and so whatever is happening at the time, I'm like not even really seeing, right? And so, one thing that like the movie lets us do is like look at what's actually happening at the very moment that it's happening, and that somehow it's very moving and puts you in touch with reality in this way that you're not when you're living your own life.
If I were going to add to that, good comment, I would say that there's always a bunch of different levels going on in a movie. And underlying your question, I think, is the idea that art shouldn't be just a recording machine, that it should be have some abstraction, some special quality that gives us a particular aesthetic experience. But I think that when you do something abstract, you fill in all these other layers with realism sometimes just as a matter of construction, just so as to ground the thing and let anything that happens to be abstract in there sneak up on you. And certainly one thing about this film, which is clearly contrived, is structure, so that certain things come out at certain times. And there's definitely a build towards emotional revelations of one kind or another, where you see like defenses break down, or you see defenses become inadequate. So I think there are levels of this that there are levels of this movie that you wouldn't be moved to describe in themselves as realistic, even if a lot of the stuff that you're getting on the soundtrack from the actors feels realistic, which I'm very happy to hear you say that you think it is, actually.
I would just add one thing, and then I think we'll take like one more question after this, but about, I almost feel like, if when you're living your life, you're sort of not noting what's happening because you're like thinking about the next thing that's gonna happen. You're always like living a moment ahead. Then even when you're watching a movie, there's some of that. You're thinking about what happened, you're thinking about what's gonna happen next, right? And in some way that structure, the fact that there's a narrative is actually what allows you to attend to whatever it is that you're attending to. You're seeing this moment as the moment in a story. And I think it's just a super interesting fact about like the way our brains work is that we can often attend much better to something when it's part of a story. So like if I just told you a bunch of stuff, like if I just told you like a bunch of facts, and then you walked out of here and then I asked you about it later, you wouldn't remember. But if I told it to you and it was a story, you like might remember it, right? And that's just to say that when it's a story, like each thing makes an impression on you. And so like unfortunately our lives are not stories most of the time, so we're like barely paying attention because it's just random stuff happening. But I think the structure actually is part of what gets you to attend, like that's part of why it feels realistic is the structure, because the structure like allows you to absorb the reality of every moment.
I would add to that the structure, yes, it's very good. And the structure also has the effect of focusing your attention on something concrete like that makes you think, all right, I'm seeing a scene about X or Y. And then a lot of other things that might have seemed too overt, if they were the focus of your attention, become almost ambient. They're slipped in there. You see patterns of speech, things that people say, the rhythms of things that you might not intellectually perceive. You might not slap a concept on those because you've slapped one big concept on the moment. And it allows stuff to creep around the edges of your intellectual apprehension of the movie.
Great. Okay, last question.
Come around this way. Could you hand it over for me?
Hello, thank you again. My question is, I didn't write it down fully, so I'm just going to ask it really fast. So the way that a lot of information is delivered, kind of, we talked about like in these half-heard phone conversations and in this kind of reported speech where it's just people asking each other about other people, and it feels like eavesdropping, right? So when you're,
Feels like what?
Eavesdropping.
Eavesdropping.
So like when you're on the train, you're listening to people's conversations, someone's talking on the phone, or two people are talking to each other, and you sort of make up a story about what their lives are like, how they relate to each other, and that's what it felt like to me watching this movie, right? And you said it also relied a lot on implications. So, we're never told that Joe dies. You just hear, you pick it up from context. You pick up a lot of other major events in this movie from context. And you make a lot of assumptions about the characters and how they relate to each other from these half-heard conversations, just one side of it, and not even really any relevant information. So to what extent is that supposed to kind of, and you draw a lot of conclusions. So to what extent, and like, I think more than other movies, this is kind of open to interpretation then, like you draw totally different conclusions about the characters, like who they are as people, what their lives were like, whatever, what their motivations are. So to what extent is like the audience's experience supposed to reflect like the characters' sort of imperfect communication and kind of opacity to each other? And also as a tag onto that, based on my own interpretation, due to my own biases, did you mean to make like Mara and her partner and her new best friend Jewish? Was that on purpose? And how does that relate to her idealization of Joe and relationship to her, and how she sees herself relative to Joe?
Now, give me that list again. Mara and her partner.
Like Adam.
Adam and her best friend, who is not Joe but the one at school. I'll answer that one first. No, I didn't really. I don't think I was thinking too much in terms of specificity of ethnicity or social groups. So that's interesting to explore, and if I move on, I guess we won't explore it. But I think, sorry, I'm just coughing. I think that when you hear a partial conversation, you could see that as being less about what you're finding out about the people and what you're not finding out about the people, as it is about your experience of getting partial information in real life. And that, I think, is what's on my mind. Like when I do something like that, when I do a conversation where you can't tell what's going on, and I genuinely can't tell everything that's going on in that very first conversation in the school where Mara's talking to Joe on the phone. I think that I'm trying to give an experience of, maybe this could be interpreted one way. Maybe something was said that we didn't hear, but one way or another it somehow led to this. I'm trying to recreate, I think, a sense of experience of hearing only part of something, which is fun and which is part of life. I enjoy things like that. So I would say if I mean something to be characterization, I hope I will be a better custodian of it, that I'll like bring it out at some point. I guess.
Okay, well, let's thank Dan for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming and for your great questions. And our final Night Owls of the year is on May 4th with C.T. Wen. It's called Is Life a Game? He wrote this book called Games, Agency as Art. And he's also going to talk to us about like social media and the gamification of life and stuff. It'll be great. So that's May 4th.